Tonight, what I want us to do is we're going to run from about now till about 8:15 or thereabouts. And here's what I'll do. I'll be working back and forth with the whiteboard to kind of explicate what I'll be talking about. And you can feel free to ask your questions in the middle of what I'm talking about. But here's how I'd like you to do it. If you have a question or want further clarification, or you just want to ask a question about what I'm talking about, you just raise your hand, and I'll take note of it. I won't have forgotten about it, but I'll wait for about a 30-second or 20-second or a minute, whatever it takes to get to a place where I think I can take it and answer it and do that, okay? But you feel free anywhere along the line just to raise your hand. Keep it up until you think I've seen it. Sometimes I'll see it before you think I have, but you leave it up long enough anyway, and then I'll grab the question. I'll wait another 20 seconds or so when I think I'm at a good point, and I'll take the question, okay? So let's begin. And tonight we're going to be talking about Christian worldview, or contending for the Christian worldview. So what I want to do is provide you with a large framework, so to speak, in which to think about this idea of contending for the Christian worldview. So let's begin with a definition, and then let me open that up a little bit. A worldview, and let's start with a definition of a worldview. A worldview is a conceptual framework or system of thought through which everything is given meaning and context. A conceptual framework or system of thought through which everything is given meaning or context. Or another way we can say this is to put it this way. A worldview frames and organizes your experience for you. It frames and organizes it. Now, I'm not saying that everybody understands in a sophisticated way that they have a worldview, but everybody has one, whether they know it or not or know what it is. Every day, their experience is being framed and organized for them by a worldview that they possess. So an example of this would be something like what I'm going to put on the board. I have two series of 4 dots here. Now, I can draw those dots or connect them like this, or I can connect them like this. And so that's what a worldview does. It frames and organizes your experience. Your experience, so to speak, doesn't come already put together for you, but what begins to happen is you frame and organize it by this worldview. So it's very important to realize, first of all, that everyone has a worldview. Everybody has a conceptual way or system of thought or conceptual framework that is organizing their experience for them and giving a meaning and context to it. It's making sense of life for them. It's framing and organizing it for them and putting it together in such a way that their life has meaning and context. So everybody you run into and everybody you talk to, every statement you make to them is being framed and organized through a pre-existing worldview that they have, just like you have a Christian worldview. And so when you hear things or experience things, you traffic it through and navigate it through that worldview, so to speak. So does everyone else through their worldview, whether they know it or not. Now, we can take worldviews and in a very simple way, we can organize them in around 3 categories. First of all, theism. Now, theism will break down into 3 views. Theism meaning that you agree or think that there's at least something beyond the natural world. Something beyond the natural world, just in a general way. And this can come up in 3 different perspectives. The first one we'll call deism. Now, deism emphasizes one aspect of the Christian doctrine of the Godhead. It puts a heavy emphasis on transcendence. Transcendence theologically means that God is separate from and distinct from his creation. He is transcendent from. He is not to be identified with that which he made. He's separate and distinct from it. That's what transcendence means. Deism emphasizes a God who is transcendent. By the way, not a God who's immanent or involved in his creation. In fact, as Thomas Jefferson said, God would really not need to perform any miracles because that would actually make him not a very good creator if he had to come in and do a miracle to make things better than it was when he made them. And so therefore the Jeffersonian Bible has all the miracle stories removed because a transcendent deistic God does not need, you see, to perform any miracles. Otherwise it would be saying that he was not a good creator to start with. And so deism emphasizes a transcendent God. Now, in modern sort of setting, we have people who believe in what? There's something beyond the world, but of course this God is not necessarily personal or involved in their life in any way, shape, or form. And so in one sense, we might say they are deists underneath this rubric of theism. Okay? A second category would be polytheism. Clearly, many gods, right? Now, normally you would identify this view here with probably what's called the Greco-Roman pantheon of gods. That is, at one point, and some people, I should say sociologists of religions, people would say that religion is actually a way to control the world around you, or a tool to control nature. And therefore it starts out in the Greek and Roman world as assigning a god to some element of nature. Thor, the thunder god, you see. Zeus is over all the gods. Now, most people would relegate this to the past, but of course, I would say that American society is having a resurgence of polytheism in this way. If you look at the Gallup polls, and I'm plus or minus 3 points, right? And they would say that about 92% of the people interviewed would say that they believe in God. And so what can happen is the church might go, hip, hip, hooray. Look, really everything is moving in our direction. We don't have a secularization of society. We actually have a very sacred society because, look, 92% of the people are claiming that they believe in God. But now, of course, the question becomes, as soon as you ask them to provide you with content for this term God, what we find out is there's about as many gods as there are people who are interviewed to give content. And so what's beginning to happen is this term here, God, is becoming a frame by which people can pour their own subjective concrete, so to speak, into and make it whatever they want it to be. So when people say they believe in God, the real question to ask is, tell me about this God, and on what basis do you think he's like you think he is? And so what happens is we have a lot of subjectivism in terms of the subject pouring the content into the objective word God. You see, because where else can they get it? They've divorced it from a revelation of a God who says he has to reveal who he is and self-communicate it. So the only place to fill the vacuum from would be from their own heart and mind. And so therefore, they just take the word God and pour in this term. Now we're seeing today, of course, in this polytheistic concept, is this. Now Jesus is becoming another term that people now are pouring their own subjective content into, this word Jesus. And of course they do it by putting this in the front of it. My Jesus, you see. My Jesus doesn't think like that. So listening to a talk radio show recently where a woman evangelical was being interviewed, on the show the guy was sort of pressing her, and he said, well, because you're an evangelical Christian, you must be against homosexuality. And her comment was, my Jesus doesn't have a problem with that. You see? And so she assumed now that when she put my in front of the term Jesus, she could sort of make Jesus anything she wanted. And so what she did was Jesus becomes like a ball of clay. And you begin to mold it the way you want him to be. But the question becomes, what does the objective historical person named Jesus think about the concept that she was being grilled upon? But you see, by putting my in front of it, what we're getting is now a polytheism inside even the church. And so the question now becomes, I find, that whenever you see terms like this, or any of these terms, you can't assume we're talking common language anymore. We can't assume that, you see. And so what we have to begin to do now is ask people what they mean when they talk about disciple or discipleship or the Spirit or God or Jesus, because what's happening is, because there's really a dearth in terms of the teaching of the Word of God across the board, that people now are having to provide a vacuum with their own ideas and thoughts. And so we're coming up with a very American polytheistic culture, but a polytheistic culture inside the church as well. And by the way, it's rather interesting. Most people think by adding this personal possessive pronoun my in front of it, they assume that that ends the argument. You know? What are you going to say? My Jesus, as if there's about 150 of them out there, you know, can have all these sort of conflicting views with one another. And so we have a very polytheistic culture. So it's not an old situation. It's a very relevant and current contemporary one. Inside, by the way, the rubric of theism. Now, the third derivative of this is, and I'll just walk it over here, is monotheism, a belief in one God. Now, three strains here under monotheism. We have Islam, we have Judaism, and of course we have Christianity. Now, just as deism emphasized the transcendence of God, so monotheism emphasizes the transcendence but adds another theological concept, and that is the concept of immanence. That this God is not only separate and distinct from his creation and not to be identified with it, ergo he's transcendent, but he's also not limited by his creation. He can also get back involved in it. And so he's immanent. So Christianity, as well as Judaism and Islam, walk the tension line of a God who's not deistic and is not pantheistic, but in fact is separate and distinct from, but is not limited by, and thus can be involved in his creation that he made. And so these monotheistic views would walk the tension between transcendence and immanence. Now, in Islam, of course, this is related to, and I'll just abbreviate the letter M, Muhammad the Prophet. And his dates are approximately 560 to 632 AD. Muhammad gets a vision from God and has those visions recorded in what's called the Quran. And I'll transliterate it here, K-O-R-A-N. And so, in the Quran, and then he's able to unite all the tribes in Arabia around this faith. And of course, Islam now is having a resurgence in our society under the term, of course, Muslim. Many athletes are becoming black Muslims. And of course, where this is occurring is in our inner cities. And the reason it occurs in our inner cities like Chicago, New York, L.A., Miami, mostly Chicago, New York, L.A. are the typical cities, is because what happens is when the socioeconomic status of the evangelical rises, what they tend to do is move to the suburbs. And when they move to the suburbs, what they do is they build a brand new building out there, exit the inner city, and leave it to the Catholics or to the Muslims. And the Muslims come in and they use sort of a Nietzschean argument, and they say something like this. The reason I know this because I teach a lot of Afro-American Christian students, and what they say is that the argument used by the Muslims against Christianity is that we will empower you to get out of your situation. Christianity causes you to accept it and acts as if suffering is okay and leaves it alone, is used by the establishment to keep a conservative situation going for the white people. And of course, it could be used that way, right? I remember Christians who shared their faith with blacks because they wanted them to become white. They didn't want to become Christians, they just wanted them to act white, not black. And so we used to call that Oreos. Black on the outside, white on the inside, you see. And they said, don't become an Oreo cookie. And so this is what's happening in our inner cities, and the Muslim and the Islamic faith is having a real resurgence there. Now, of course, we have Judaism, which is based upon the teaching of the Old Testament, and then, of course, the commentaries and the legal precedents from the rabbis, which is called the responsa. These responses are a casuistic or a case-by-case study of how biblical principles were applied to specific examples, and then you have a whole commentary or legal framework called the responsa developed, in which is a basis of Judaism along with the Old Testament. And then lastly, of course, Christianity, which its main touchstone proposition is the incarnation. That is, that the second person of the Trinity took on human flesh in space and time. If that's the case, then Christianity claims an exclusivism for itself, for if God took on flesh only in this faith, then everybody else is wrong and they're right. And this leads to what is a death word on the college campus, religious exclusivism. The word you don't want to be associated with is exclusivism on the college campus. What you want to be associated with is this word, inclusivism, or tolerance. Now, just for a second, let me digress, because I think this is kind of a helpful little sidelight to take. I was in a classroom about a year and a half ago, and a professor said to me, well, if this is all true, then what you're talking about, and Christianity's talking about, is an exclusivism. That is, you're right, or Christianity's right, and everybody else is wrong. And I said, well, guys, let me ask you a question. If I wrote on the board, 2 times 2 equals 5, what would you say to me? He said, well, I'd say you're wrong. And I said, gosh, you're really intolerant. You really have an exclusive view of mathematics. You act as if 2 times 2 always has to be 4. Why can't it be 5 or 7? And he said, well, if you're going to push it a little bit, then let's push it. And I said, okay, we'll push it. And he said, well, actually, all mathematics is arbitrary concepts that we impose upon experience. I said, really? I said, so in other words, if it turns out that I owe you $8, you'll live with me giving you $1. Is it okay? I said, if it's an arbitrary subjective concept that I impose upon experience, then can I impose and make 8 1? Well, no. Well, guys, doesn't that bother you that maybe it's not as arbitrary as you once thought? You know? Now, what comes out of this, however, is this, and here's the point. The question is not being exclusive. Remember that the question is this. Because truth by its very nature will... It doesn't matter what it is, whatever you're talking about. If you have a number of people and say there are 150 people in here, if that's the truth, then that means 149 won't work and 151 won't either. The question is just as is it the truth? If it's the truth, then there's nothing wrong with it being exclusive, because by the very nature of truth, it will be exclusive. You see? And so the only question that we have to answer when we discuss Christianity is there good, solid evidence for believing it's the truth? If it is, then there's nothing wrong with us saying we're right and other people might be wrong. You see? It's just a question of whether it's the truth. It's not a haughty, arrogant, pretentious statement we're making. It's the kind of statement we'd make about anything that was truth. If you were counting the chairs in here, you see, a truthful statement would correspond with how many there are. If you were one off, it would be wrong. You'd be eliminating every other number except the exact number there are. You see? And so it's a question of whether or not it's just true. That's all it really amounts to. So don't feel, how can I put it, like you have to shirk or shrink back when somebody claims you're an exclusivist. Anybody who believes in truth is an exclusivist. The only people who wouldn't would be inclusivists, and of course they believe in inclusive and they think that's the truth, so they're exclusive of everything else, aren't they? So, you know, we have a problem. So the old idea is that everybody's after this, whether they say it or not.